So thank you all very much for coming to this, which is our last in the this current season of events in collaboration with the Anglo-Russian Research Network. It's been a real pleasure working with them, and if you have any ideas for seminars or book discussions, please let them know. They're open for submissions at the moment, and the details for submitting are on the event pages for these Anglo-Russian Research Network events. My name is Rafy Hay. I'm the Director of Programming at Pushkin House, and we've been working with them for these last 6 weeks. And I'd like to just thank Miran Maguire and Anna Maslyanova especially for organising them and for doing a lot of work to promote them. And the response has been great. So we've been really pleased to host them. And thank you to all of our speakers as well. Sarah Gear today is the latest, but we've had 5 other amazing speakers. Tonight's talk will be a slight departure from the history aspect that we've been seeing in the other talks, and is focused on the contemporary and future of Russian translation in English. So Sarah Gear is a second-year PhD student at the University of Exeter, and her work there is focused on the translation world and the way that politics and translation and publishing kind of intersect. And probably we'll be hearing a lot more about that tonight. I don't think I should really say too much more, and I think I'll probably just say thank you everybody for joining. Please remain muted through the presentation. If you have a question that really needs to be asked in vocally, we can unmute you at the end. But do put your questions in the chat throughout. It's probably the easiest way, just as soon as it comes to you. So without much further ado, I'll hand over to Sarah. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Rafy. Right, I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me a second. Okay, I hope everyone can see my screen okay and can hear me. So thank you to the Anglo-Russian Research Network for organising all this, and Anna Maslyanova and Miran as well. And thank you also to Rafy for hosting this evening, and of course for everyone for turning up on this cold winter's night. So I don't know about you, but I've really enjoyed all of the talks over the past few weeks, which have covered such a broad range of topics, and all speak, I suppose, to our enduring fascination of Russia, from John Bowring, who worked as one of the first translators from Russian to English, to Marion Fell and her work bringing Chekhov to the English language audience, to the talk we had about Russian emigres in the 19th and 20th century, sort of fueling and pushing forward the interest that everybody has in Russia, to the power of Penguin to bring Russian literature to the masses in the 20th century. Last week, Nick Hall gave a really interesting talk about how British travellers went to the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And in part, he spoke about the role that literature played in forming these travellers' opinions about the Soviet Union. In fact, what happened is these opinions were often preformed before they even travelled. They were either pro-Soviet or anti-Soviet, as I understood it. But the literature that they read before they travelled sort of played a role in forming their opinions. And to some extent, that is what I would like to talk about today, the same question. To what extent does Russian literature explain what we feel about Russia? To what extent does the Russian literary market reflect our preconceived ideas about Russia? Or rather, how does what we read reflect the contemporary narrative about Russia that exists in the West? And how do these ideas inform how we decide what to read, and not least what publishers decide to publish? So along the way, I hope to highlight some of this most sort of interesting, absorbing translations of contemporary Russian fiction into English today, and maybe help you along with some ideas for your Christmas reading lists. So there is a narrative about Russia, I feel, in the West. There is a way we're supposed to think about it. And I think this example, which was a job advert posted by the New York Times last month, explains it all. So it reads, Russia sends out hit squads armed with nerve agents against its enemies, most recently the opposition leader Alexei Navalny. It has its cyber agents sow chaos and disharmony in the West to tarnish its democratic systems, while promoting its faux version of democracy. It has deployed private military contractors around the globe to secretly spread its influence. It continues, we are looking for someone who will embrace the prospect of traversing 11 time zones to track a populace that is growing increasingly frustrated with an economy dragged down by corruption, cronyism, and excessive reliance on natural resources. The posting, they say, offers the chance to chronicle the continuing reign of one of the world's most charismatic leaders, President Vladimir V. Putin. And they finish off by saying, not to mention, Putin ushered in changes to the constitution, so he will likely stay in power for many years to come. And of course, we are on the cusp of a new, less Putin-friendly president in the US, which should only raise the temperature between Washington and Moscow. This is how we are to see contemporary Russia, an exotic, unfathomable country with a leader who does not govern, but who reigns, and who is actively opposing the West. So today I would like to talk about contemporary Russian literature and how we consume it, what we consume, and who decides. And I use the word consume deliberately because whatever the reason that we read Russian literature in translation, we're all viewed as consumers by the publishing market. And we have to bear in mind that what we read from and about Russia is curated by publishers and other gatekeepers of one kind and another. So as Rafy said, I'm currently in my second year of my PhD at the University of Exeter, and my project is investigating how politics and publishing intersect. And to do that, I'm looking at the novels written by two ideologically different groups of authors. So in broad strokes, because there's plenty of grey around here, I'm comparing the commission, translation and reception of novels by three ostensibly nationalist writers with those of three ostensibly liberal writers. Now, there is a real divide in Russia in both the literary scene and in Russian society along liberal and nationalist lines. Liberal writer Mikhail Shishkin talks about a literary civil war, you can see in this quote here. And in this context, he characterizes nationalists as people who see Russia as an island surrounded by an ocean of enemies, and liberals who believe that we belong with the whole of civilization, that we must be together with the Western world. As Shishkin sees it, liberal and nationalist movements define themselves through their relationship with Europe, with the liberals broadly in favor of Europeanization and the nationalists against it. If we want to be more specific, again, within the Russian context, the nationalist writers can often, though not always, be described as Krymnash, people who believe that Crimea is ours. The nationalist writers that I am looking at for my research are Zakhar Prilepin, you can see him in the top right-hand corner there, and I'm looking at his anti-government protest novel, Sankhya. I'm also looking at Mikhail Elizarov, he's in the top left-hand corner, and his rather gory novel about the power of books and the librarian. And the third nationalist author I'm looking at is Roman Senchin, there in the middle, with his new realist novel called Minus, which is set in the town of Minusинsk in southern Siberia. So I'm comparing the journey of these three novels with the nationalist writers with the journeys of the more liberal writers. So Vladimir Sorokin is one of them. He's in the middle there, dressed in white. I'm going to be looking at him and his political satire called Day of the Oprichnik. In the top right-hand corner, Lyudmila Ulitskaya with her Big Green Tent, which is essentially a sort of epic ode to the Russian intelligentsia. And then in the top left there, you have Mikhail Shishkin with his sort of ephemeral, very hard to pin down, but very beautiful novel, Maidenhair. So I've selected each of these writers because they have each taken an either largely liberal or largely nationalist approach and political stance that actively informs their public persona, either through their work or through their extra-textual activities. Opinion about publishing some of these writers is divided. Some translators, editors, and publishers, and indeed critics, will not touch politically difficult writers such as Prilepin, while others believe in the importance of allowing readers simply to decide for themselves and are willing to translate, publish, or review authors whose work they feel has literary merit or perhaps marketing potential, despite their tricky political views and, in some cases, actions. So In order to understand how politics might feed into the choices made by the various actors in the published industry, whether conscious or otherwise, and in order to cite these 6 novels, it's helpful to understand what's being translated from Russian into English in general. This, however, is not an insignificant challenge. The first issue is that there's no fully reliable translation database kept in the UK or the US. Other European countries who traditionally translate more than we do keep a database of translations, but this is not the case here. In 2012, Literature Across Frontiers commissioned a study to investigate this. The way it works at the moment is that there is a UNESCO-run Index Translatorium, which sounds very much like something from Philip Pullman's Dark Materials. And this is a searchable database of all the books translated across Europe. Each individual country feeds in its data. For the UK, this comes from the British National Bibliography, which gets its data from the British Library, and Nielsen Book Data, who get their information from the publishers themselves. In order to identify translations, publishers first have to flag up the fact that a new book is a translation, and then it is up to them to provide the translators' names, original publication details, original language and original title, and so forth. The problem is that publishers have to pay more to sort of fill in all of these data fields, and not everyone does it. So this means that what information we have is often incomplete, and it's not possible to carry out a fully comprehensive search which will provide all of these details in any one database. As a result, I've started to compile my own, which is rather a lengthy process, but for this I'm drawing information from various different sources. So the most official of these is the Nielsen book database, which provides information on sales figures, annual bestsellers, numbers of units sold, publisher market share, and so on. I've also used 2 American sources because obviously there's a lot of crossover between the UK and the US. I've referred to the Searchable Translation Database, which is hosted by the Publishing Weekly website and was begun by 3% and Open Letter Books at the University of Rochester in 2008. I've also taken data from the translator Lisa Hayden's blog, Leasock's Bookshelf, which I cannot recommend highly enough. This list Lisa collates every year by scouring publishers' websites, their catalogues, with tip-offs from her contacts and so forth, and this she also began in 2008. Other data I have added myself as I've discovered gaps in both lists. This data has in part come from 2 main funding websites in Russia, Transcript and Institute Perivoda, which I'll talk a bit more about later. So I'm sure the list I have is far from comprehensive, but I currently have 376 contemporary texts listed that have been translated from Russian to English since 2008, and these have been published by 132 different publishers. So this seems like a lot of titles, and it's generally good news. It ties in with the data from the Literature Across Frontiers study about translations in the UK. This study analysed data from 3 sample years, 2000, 2005 and 2008, and reported an 80% rise in the number of translations published over that time. Lisa Hayden's annual list, as well as the 3% database, and indeed the data from Nielsen, would point to the same trend in an increase in Russian translations, and also, thankfully, an increase in Russian translation sales. So according to the Nielsen book data, there's definitely been an increase since 2001 as well. That year, Russian to English translations only generated £500,000 in the UK, whereas in the best year so far, which was 2009, the market generated £1.7 million. Last year, it was down a little at about 1.5 million, and there were 876 different ISBNs sold as Russian translation, which is a huge improvement on the meagre 315 that sold in 2001. The number of books actually sold, however, are quite small. Over the past 18 years, many titles that make it into Nielsen's annual top 50 of Russian translations don't even sell 1,000 copies. The bestseller over the past 2 decades was in 2016, when the BBC aired their serialization of War and Peace. That year, 27,500 copies of the BBC tie-in book were sold. The second bestseller, interestingly, at 26,500 copies roughly, was a Penguin £1 edition of Tolstoy's How Much Land Does a Man Need?, followed closely by Night Watch by Sergei Lukyanenko in 2007, which sold just over 23,000 copies when it was made into the hit film Night Watch. So if we look at Nielsen's top 50 bestsellers every year in Russian translation, we can learn a lot. So over the past 18 years, you can see that most of the interest is centered around the translations of Russian classics rather than contemporary work. Rather unsurprisingly, out of a possible 908 entries, that's 50 per year for 18 years, Tolstoy appears 198 times in the top 50, followed closely by Dostoevsky, who's there 146 times, Bulgakov at 107, Lermontov and Turgenev have 25 or so spots each, with only one spot each for Platonov and Lermontov. So this should be compared with the share of the market enjoyed by contemporary fiction, with the biggest author, Boris Akunin, only listed 35 times over 18 years. In fact, the contemporary market only makes up 13% of this top 50 list and is represented by only 8 different authors. So why do the Russian classics sell so much? It could simply be that readers understand what Russian classics are and are comfortable with them. And this makes them a safe bet for publishers. If we want to be a little bit more cutthroat about it, there are other more practical considerations at play in a market where there is very little money to be made, not least that if an author is dead, there are no royalties to pay, and there are no book tours to fund. The other reason for the low sales of contemporary novels is that the shelves of bookshops are simply flooded with translations of Tolstoy or Dostoevsky and so forth. So I think I've worked out that last December was the last time I was actually in a bookshop, Glasgow, Waterstones in the centre of Glasgow. And there were beautiful, beautiful displays. You walk in and there are various different editions of War and Peace, Master and Margarita, Brothers Karamazov, Life and Fate, but no contemporary novels on display at all. When I went and searched in the shelves for the 6 writers I'm studying, I only found Sorokin's 2 novels, Day of the Oprichnik and The Blizzard, both published by Penguin Classics. Perhaps it's understandable that the smaller presses such as Glagoslav and the now defunct Glass that published some of the nationalist writers on my list weren't represented, but Ulitskaya, who was published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, Maidenhair, published by Open Letter, and The Librarian by Pushkin Press were all sort of equally absent. So, which begs the question, if readers can't easily find contemporary fiction in bookshops, how are they to find out about new titles? If we turn our attention to exactly what kind of contemporary fiction makes it to the top 50, most of the titles could be referred to not necessarily as literary, but rather genre fiction. Boris Akunin has had huge success with his detective mystery Fandorin series, while Lukyanenko's novels, as we said, are linked with a successful film, and Gluchovsky's Metro series of novels are tied to a popular computer game. The only examples of sort of real literary fiction per se are represented here by Pelevin, who has 3 titles in the list, by Lyudmila Petrushevskaya and her scary fairy tales, which I adore, which come in the form of the very beautifully titled There Once Lived a Woman Who Tried to Kill Her Neighbor's Baby. And also Vadaleskin, he's also one of my favorites with his fantastic novel Lauras. The second best-selling contemporary author here is Andrei Kurkov, a writer who is not a big name in Russia and who lives in Ukraine. The editor of a well-known Russian literary journal asked me last year why he was so popular in the UK when no one at home pays him any attention. So the popularity of the classics and of a certain type of contemporary fiction seems to agree with a pattern that was identified by Mark Lipovetsky in 2013. During a roundtable discussion for the journal Znamia, titled Is There a Place for Modern Russian Literature in the Global Context, he talked about the fact that 2 kinds of Russian novels are popular in the States. The first category are novels that represent what he calls the Russian exotic. That is, books that present a mix of what we think of as Russian literature, which is probably literature that was written in the 19th century with potentially sort of downtrodden, suffering characters. And latterly, that might mean novels that blend in elements of Stalin and the Gulag, or even sort of the 90s mafia, for example. He gives the example of Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate as ticking most of these boxes. It's about Stalin and the war, but it's sort of built in 19th century proportions. And indeed, this is one of the first Russian books that you'll see on the display in your local bookshop. The other group Lipovetsky describes is that of novels that don't require too much cultural translation, books that where you kind of basically ignore the Russian context to an extent and just read. He cites Akunin's detective novels as an example here. In other words, these are books that do not challenge the ethnocentricity or the lack of contextual knowledge of the Anglophone reader. They are more universal and simply more accessible. This pattern is sort of further confirmed if you look at the top 10 best-selling novels from last year, and this again comes from Nielsen book data. You can see that the only contemporary writer listed here at all is Gluchowski, and Robert Chandler's excellent translations of Vasily Grossman's Stalin and Stalingrad and Life and Fate take quite deservedly 2 of the top spots. The other thing that this top 10 list demonstrates is to what extent the big 5, soon to be the big 4, when Penguin, Random House take over Simon & Schuster, how much they dominate the market. Most evident, so I'll start again, sorry. So yeah, it's obvious that there's a lot of Penguin, basically, titles here. The data from Nielsen backs this up, in fact. So Penguin and its various imprints take between 60 and 70% of the market share in Russian translation each year. In 2019, their books accounted for 72.3% of the Russian translation market. Now, to give you an idea of how much market share some of the other sort of most active publishers of Russian literature have, Pushkin Press accounts for 1.85% of the market, and all of the rest remain below 1% of the market share, with publishing houses specializing in Russian literary translation, such as Glagoslav, sitting at 0.01%. Therefore, what publishing houses such as Penguin produce is very important and certainly skews the market, not to mention the power they have to get their books into the shops in the first place. So here I've listed all of the contemporary Russian authors that the big 5 have published since 2008. You can see that they've only published 11 different authors between them in the past 12 years. Now, all of these authors fall into relatively safe, I suppose, political categories. And please note that each one of my liberal authors, Sorokin, Shishkin, and Ulitskaya, have made the list. Clearly, these are all authors that these larger publishers believe that they can sell to the general reading public, and that therefore represent, I guess, the least financial risk. Penguin's list is also perhaps the most informative. As we have already discussed, their disproportionate share of the market makes them one of the most visible publishers of Russian literature, and yet their selection of books is actually surprisingly narrow. All of them are, of course, excellent, but all of them are sort of political in some way. Svetlana Alexievich's sort of moving documentary work and Victoria Lamasko's fascinating graphic reportage are perhaps the most overtly political of these. But Petrushevskaya and Sorokin are not fans of the Russian government. Andrei Kurkov is a writer who lives in Ukraine, and if you sort of judge by his introduction to his new novel, Grey Bees, is against the war. And meanwhile, Boris Akunin is, I believe, in permanent sort of self-imposed exile from Russia. The other point to make about the Penguin list is that Penguin is not the original publisher for any of these texts. For example, Sorokin was first published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and Lamasko was published by independent M+1 before being sold to Penguin UK. It seems that Penguin, one of the largest publishing houses listed here, and the one with the most influence on what we read, is unwilling to take any risks. It would also seem that Penguin publishes the dissident literature that readers in the West most want to associate with Russia. As a side note, most of the non-fiction published by the big 5 follows the same narrative about Russia. And in fact, this genre is sort of probably tells the reader even more about attitudes towards Russia than translated fiction does. So various titles published by Penguin Random House in the past few years include, and the titles tell you an awful lot, Resurrection, The Struggle for a New Russia, A History of the Gulag, The Dead Hand, which is about the Cold War, The Invention of Russia, The Rise of Putin and the Invention of Fake News, Putin's Labyrinth, Spies, Murder and the Dark Heart of the New Russia, or The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin. You get the picture. In short, these are books that both respond to and help to shape the narrative that we have about Russia in the West, whether the claims in these books are true or not, taking them into account alongside the literature that Penguin publishes, which runs the gamut between either vaguely or wholly politicized. We have to take this as their main thrust. Just like the New York Times, Penguin has a story about Russia that works and that presumably sells and that we want to read. So this is not at all how the smaller presses operate. In fact, so you'll recall that I mentioned there were 132 different publishers producing Russian translation over the last 12 years. And it seems that for them are far more important than any money they might make, and making money is not a given at all. What's important for them is the cultural capital, or rather kudos, of publishing an interesting and varied catalogue of authors that the larger publishers are not always able to take a risk on. So it can be quite revealing then to see what their lists include. So perhaps one of the most exciting projects at the moment is the one hosted by Columbia University Press with their Russian library, which is funded by Read Russia and Institute Perivoda. They invited translators to pitch their dream books for translation, and as a result have ended up with a large choice. From among the 27 titles the Russian library has published to date, only 5 of them are from contemporary authors, but they come from writers such as Olga Slavnikova, Margarita Khemlin and Maria Stepanova, and are all to be highly recommended. The New York Review of Books publishes also a vast array of titles, both contemporary and non-contemporary. Here you'll see Sorokin's The Queue, which was translated by Sally Laird, which tells the story of people standing in an endless queue in Soviet Russia and of the life that goes on whilst they're waiting. What they're queuing for, the readers rather, and the people standing in the queue are rather unaware. You'll also see, I've got a picture here of Tatiana Tolstoy's beautiful book, The Slings, which was translated by Jamie Gambrell. And this is a fantastic post-apocalyptic view of a Russia that has been destroyed by some kind of apocalyptic event, we think perhaps a nuclear explosion, and has sent Russia back to the new dark ages. Also here, published by New York Review of Books, is Maxim Osipov's quirky and beautifully translated and beautifully crafted short stories, translated by Boris Dralyuk, Alex Fleming, and Anne-Marie Jackson. One World, I have to admit, publishes some of my most favourite books and some of my most cherished translations. I think you might have heard me mention Vodolazk and Laurus already, because it made it into Nielsen's top 50 in 2016. This sort of begins in medieval Russia, and it blends magic and mysticism and just takes the reader on just a beautiful, rich, enchanting sort of journey that stays with you for a long time. The Aviator, also by Vodolazkin, is another of my favourite novels. It follows again the partly sort of magical adventures of a prisoner of the far northern Solovki prison camp who wakes up at the wrong end of the century, and to tell you any more would be spoiling it. Finally, another of my favourites from here, Three Apples Fell from the Sky by Narine Avgadian, set in the Armenian mountains, is just one of the most captivating books I've read all year, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. All of these novels, by the way, were translated by Lisa Hayden. And of course, there are plenty other publishers at work. So Deep Velen, they who are actually soon to join forces with Dalkey Archive, they concentrate on Russophone novels, often from the former Soviet republics, such as Dagestan, and they do this by bringing over the work of Alisa Ganyeva into English. While New Vessel Press publishes novels by Sergei Lebedev, who writes variously about the fall of the Soviet Union, the Gulag, and long-buried family sagas. Overlook publishes Max Fry's fantasy series, The Labyrinths of Echo, and Olga Slavnikova's stunning adventure 2017. Amazon Crossing, which I kind of hesitate as referring to as independent, is responsible for bringing over a glut of contemporary genre fiction, not least Marian Petroisen's mammoth fantasy novel, Grey House. The most prolific of all of these publishers is Glagoslav, who certainly punch above their weight in the number of Russian translations they produce each year. I believe they've published 32 contemporary novels over the past 8 years, but they are marred in part by a system that prefers well-known publishers to the smaller ones. As Mark Lipovetsky points out in his roundtable discussion, who publishes a novel matters to readers in the UK and the US. We tend to trust the judgment of a larger publishing house, not to mention that the novels are simply easier to find out about and get hold of. What this breakdown does show us, though, is that there is a large amount of exciting Russian literature being translated into English. The problem seems to be more based in the fact that, because of the way the publishing market works and the way in which books are distributed, we are simply less likely to hear about them, or find ourselves, I suppose, equipped to understand what it is from this long and varied list that we most want to read. Hopefully, this sort of overview of publishers of contemporary fiction will help to inspire some of your own future reading, at least. So Behind the sales figures and the top 50 lists, I guess it's also vital to understand the decision-making processes that go on within the publishing industry. I'm in the process of conducting a large number of interviews with the people who are essentially the gatekeepers to Russian literature in translation. The translators, the editors, the authors, agents, and literary critics, not crickets. And speaking with these people provides insight into the data that I have about translation. The motivations for publishing Russian literature in translation are various. For some publishing houses, having literature, Russian literature, which is apparently still perceived by some as exotic, adds prestige value to their catalogue. For others, such as independent publisher Glagoslav, it is simply its raison d'etre. Some publishing houses might be guided more by the interests and tastes of individual editors, and it seems that perhaps the most crucial factor governing what gets commissioned is, to a large part, luck. What is clear and what is demonstrated by the Nielsen data is that people do not publish Russian titles for money. The publishers that produce Russian translations are clearly the biggest gatekeepers to what makes it to our bookshelves. And so it's helpful to understand the journey that each novel goes on during the translation process. Through my interviews, it's slowly becoming clear that a large amount of what gets published, it comes down to a number of reasons. The largest of these is pure chance. So it might be that an editor hears about a book from a relative or friend, or that they meet an author while traveling in Russia, or they've been speaking to publishers at book fairs. Maybe they simply come across a book they love and want to share it. Many of the editors I've spoken to have a pre-existing interest in Russia, and so are naturally drawn to publish titles that others might shy away from. Once an editor finds a book they want to publish, there is a clear process. In all but the smaller publishers, a reader will be drafted in, often recruited on a word-of-mouth basis, to assess the book for translation and to prepare a reader's report. Once approved, financial considerations, in essence the marketability of a certain text, has to be assessed. A decision has to be made as to whether the outlays for paying the translator and acquiring the rights for a book can be covered. Funding is often crucial. The smaller presses are more likely to need funding for translations, but it seems that most presses, large and small, have applied for funding at some point. There are two main sources of funding that publishers can apply for, either from Transcript, which is run by the Prokhorov Foundation, or the Institute Perivoda, which is Russia's Institute of Translation. The vast majority of translations would simply be impossible without these funding bodies, largely because there is simply a greater risk taken on by publishers with translated titles than regular fiction. And indeed, the increase in translations from Russian since Transcript was founded in 2009 and Institute Perivoda in 2011 is testament to how important their support is. So to highlight how much the industry depends on funding, I thought it would be useful to see exactly what kinds of contemporary titles receive funding from these two sources. So Transcript lists all of the texts it funds on its website. And looking through the list, it's clear quite how much work they do. The translations, they don't just fund translations into English, and of course they fund a vast number of languages. And this is just a small selection of what they have funded in the last 10 years. So you can see that they funded some highly successful novels, including Laurus, which keeps reappearing, as we've discussed. You'll also see the Nobel Prize winner Svetlana Alexievich's fantastic Second-Hand Time here, translated by Bela Shayevich, and the UK favourite Andrei Kurko's latest novel Grey Bees, translated by Boris Dralyuk. Institute Perivoda's new website also now lists all the translations that it has funded since 2011. And again, you can see the wide variety of texts from writers with actually wildly varying political stances, from Prilepin's The Monastery, translated by Nicholas Kotar, to Ludmila Ulitskaya's Big Green Tent, translated by Polly Gannon, and Shishkin's Maidenhair, translated by Marin Schwartz. Their close work with Read Russia, who have been running the Read Russia Prize they've been running the fantastic program of events this week for the Russian Literature Week. And they've also been running the Read Russia Prize. This is a biennial prize for Russian literature translated into English. And this year it was won by Anthony Wood for his translations of a selection of Pushkin's poetry. But if you just look at the long list here, which is obviously a mix between contemporary and non-contemporary titles, it's quite exciting to see how much Russian literature is currently being brought over into English. The efforts of organisations such as Read Russia and Institute Perivoda and Transcript are vital for the promotion of Russian literature. For the very smallest presses, some of whom can struggle with affording a good PR, it can be an uphill struggle to get their titles viewed in heavily circulated or prestigious publications. Not only that, but creating and selling books for a reasonable price is also a factor. Whereas the larger publishers already have distribution networks in place and can subsidize book costs, some smaller publishers, such as Glagoslav, for example, have to stay online to keep the costs low. In practice, this means that if you have heard about one of their books, it can be expensive to try and track one down. To pick up a copy of Prilepin's new novel, The Monastery, on Amazon just now, it's $24.99 in paperback, although it is available on Kindle for $7.99. Bookshop, the new conglomerate of indie bookshops that has just started up in the UK, does not list the title at all. According to an article published in M+1 2 months ago, I think, with the wonderfully enigmatic title, Smorgasbords Don't Have Bottoms, this is explained in the article, but I won't go into it. The control that Amazon has, they write, over the book market is strangling. Although it does allow unparalleled access to a vast number of titles, it also makes sure to place the books that Amazon would prefer you to buy directly in your line of sight, offering you choices that you didn't even know that you wanted to make. If this is the market that smaller publishers are forced to compete in, and able to perhaps find publicity in other outlets, they are off to a bad start, which is again why all of this funding is absolutely vital to the production of new Russian translations. The role of the translator is, of course, also key in the publishing process. At times, translators will lobby for a certain title, but it seems that translators who have a strong reputation and even perhaps a brand are much more likely to be offered work than to have to search for it. In one interview, a translator explained that because of their reputation, they understood that they could approach publishers with ideas and that would be likely to be accepted. It's also clear that some translators develop allegiances with their Russian counterparts and in essence will then advocate for these authors with the publishers. The late and much-loved Jamie Gambrell had a strong working relationship with Vladimir Sorokin, for example, translating his Ice trilogy, Blizzard, and Day of the Oplichnik. Following her death earlier this year, this work is being continued by Max Lawton, who is currently working with Sorokin and is translating the remainder of Sorokin's work to date, including Blue Lard, Telluria, an illustrated version of Their Four Hearts, Sugar Kremlin, and 2 collections of his short stories. Some translators have the trust of a particular publishing house. Lisa Hayden, as you mentioned, has translated every Russian title at One World. Her reputation is very strong in the world of Russian literature, and her curated reading guide to contemporary Russian literature, both in the original and in translation, Lizok's Bookshelf, you must go and check out if you haven't already. Other translators may have a particular brand or cachet, which can help, I guess, in some ways sell or promote a translation. Belashayevich, for example, is known in part for translating political texts. Her latest translation of Zamyatin's We, although not, of course, contemporary, is made relevant today and politicized further with an introduction from Margaret Atwood, while she has also translated Nobel Prize-winning Svetlana Alexeyevich's Second-Hand Time and worked on Victoria Lamasso's Other Russias, as well as translating transcripts from the Pussy Riot trials. Although it's certainly the case that the translator's work can go unnoticed, especially by the general reading public, and it seems that at times it can be devalued or overlooked by the publishing system in general, the power that translators have to lobby for certain books and advocate for others, or even to prevent the more politically difficult writers from being published at all by simply refusing to translate them, is not to be underestimated. This can be seen in the example of Other Russias by Victoria Lamasco. So this graphic novel about life in contemporary Russia is overtly anti-Putin, and the artist and writer Lamasco was unable to get it published in Russia. A dedicated team at M+1, Mark Krotov and Belashayevich, commissioned a translator, Thomas Campbell, to work on the text and then edited it and laid it out, and have now published it in the US. This is the book that Penguin then bought to sell in the UK once it was completed, so that you can see in instances like this, the gamble has completely paid off. So to tie all of this together, and I guess to slowly round off my talk, I wanted to present you with a brief case study comparing the journey of 2 different novels from Russian to publication in English. And I'd like to do that to show how the politics and image of 2 different writers affects the publisher they go to, their subsequent reception and success. So to do that, I'm going to compare the journey of Day of the Oplichnik, written by Vladimir Sorokin, who is a mostly a liberal writer, with that of Sankhya, written by Zakhar Prilepin, who is certainly anything but liberal. Both of these novels were published in 2006 in Russia, and both to much critical acclaim and a little bit of controversy. Both of them deal with themes of authority and government. The writers are both well known in Russia, they have a large body of work, and they have won a number of prizes. So Day of the Oprichnik tells the story of Komyaga, who is an oprichnik styled on Ivan the Terrible's personal guards. It's set in Russia in 2028, which is ruled by somebody called His Majesty, who consolidates his power through the Orthodox Church and who has constructed a vast wall separating Russia from the rest of the unruly, disgusting West. It was translated by Jamie Gambrell and published in English in 2011 by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and then by Penguin Classics in 2018. And it was also finalist for the International BAHn Booker Prize. Sankhya, on the other hand, follows its eponymous hero on his adventures with a political group called the Founding Fathers, which is based very firmly in Zakhar Prilepin's experiences as a member of the National Bolshevik Party, which was an extremist political group that was banned in 2007. The novel was translated by Jeff Parker, Alina Ryabova, and Maria Gusiev, and was published in English in 2014 by Glagoslav. In keeping with the Western narrative on Russia, both books are positioned politically, and indeed their political nature is used as their main selling point, or hook, I suppose. Sankhya is politicized because he is championed in the foreword by Alexei Navalny, somebody who The Guardian routinely refers to as Putin's most vocal opposition. And Oprichnik is politicized by the quote on its front cover, although it's on the American cover, this is the British one. And on the American front cover, it's sold as Take No Prisoner satire. And on the Amazon website, it is advertised as a fierce critique of life in New Russia. So both of these books are also anti-Putin, but this is where the similarities end. And it could be why Oprichnik was published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and Sankhya by the much smaller Dzanc Books in the US and Glagoslav in the UK. Because Sankhya, as well as being anti-Putin, is also somewhat inconveniently anti-Semitic, racist, sexist, and expresses a deal of nationalist ideas. Day of the Oprichnik is far from a comfortable read, but it does satirize all of these things. So the size of the publisher is one of the factors in these novels' reception. As you can see, Farrar, Straus and Giroux's Oprichnik gets reviews from prestigious publications like the New York Times, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Kirkus Reviews, while Glagoslav Sankhya gets reviews from equally important but slightly more niche publications, Open Democracy and the 3% website at the University of Rochester. Certainly, it's clear to see how both of these novels fit into the Russian literary market and by extension into the narrative about Russia. And the reasons for commissioning Day of the Oprichnik are made very clear by Mark Krotov, who was assistant editor for Farrar, Straus and Giroux in 2011. And in that year, in an interview with Ellen Barry at the New York Times about the translation, said that he had been waiting for a book about Sorokin to come along that would suit American audiences, and that in Oprichnik he had found it. He said that despite its fantastical premise, Day of the Oprichnik didn't come off as a literary stunt, but as a distillation of what Russia had become in the era of Mr. Putin. In other words, it fit with the American and by extension British, it fit with what these audiences were expecting. It was dissident literature and it cast Putin in the role of bad guy. In the same interview, Edwin Frank, editor of NYRB Classics, who published Sorokin's Iris trilogy in the same year, said that what readers want from Russian literature is opposition to the regime. And if that wasn't the case, then it was unclear what the American readers should be interested in. Sankhya's political relevance is also strong, even if the beliefs of its author have moved on, or let's say progressed. His book is about activism and opposition to the state, and is in some ways more relevant today than it was when it was first written. The introduction by Alexei Navalny certainly helps to contextualize and sell this tricky Russian author, though in recent times, as Prilepin has sort of denounced Navalny and moved closer and closer to the heart of the Russian government, it is an increasingly misleading selling point. Another vital aspect contributing to a text commission and success and how it is marketed can be linked to the images and extra textual activities of the authors. A great example of the difference between these two writers can be seen in a review of an event that was billed as a literary duel between Sorokin and Prilepin at a book fair in Paris in 2012. Just in case you don't know, Sorokin's on the left in the white and Prilepin's in the combat gear. So the reviewer of this literary duel talks about the fact that Sorokin looks like a Russian sage. She says he is beautifully dressed with flowing silver locks and he attracts beautiful women who come and speak to him after the event. Prilepin she characterises as bald and in old jeans, and the only fans there for him are spotty young guys from the far right. The image of Sorokin is almost Tolstoyan, with his long silver hair and simple life that he leads, is also picked up by Ellen Barry in her New York Times article, where she also calls him a Russian sage. This idea is further explored by David Gillespie in his 2016 article, Vladimir Sorokin and the Return of History, where he takes up this theme and compares Sorokin's recently discovered politicism and the trouble it has made for him with the Russian state with the experiences of Tolstoy and Solzhenitsyn, and asks whether Sorokin will follow in their tradition and become the great dissident writer of the 21st century. Sorokin is, though, largely inactive politically. He revealed in an interview in Harar in 2018 that he doesn't attend demonstrations because he doesn't like crowds, and also because it won't make him a better writer. He's also ambiguous in that he supports nationalist writers such as Mikhail Elizarov and is happy that the Russian state for now leaves him in peace. Of course, he has courted major controversies and problems with the state in the past, most notably over his novel Blue Lard, which included sex scenes between clones of Stalin and Khrushchev. In short, though, Sorokin is the kind of Russian writer that the West can make sense of. He reminds us of Tolstoy. He is a dissident. He is more or less liberal. He is what we, to some extent, expect. So if Sorokin feels like a safe bet, someone that it appears okay to like, Prilepin doesn't fall into the same category. He performs far too many extra textual activities, shall we say, and he's more than vocal about his political beliefs. Prilepin fought in Chechnya, and as you've mentioned, he was a long-standing member of the National Bolshevik Party, which was founded by Eduard Limonov, who is himself a quite controversial character, and Alexander Dugin. To compound matters, in 2017, Prilepin confirmed that he had been leading a brigade in what he would call the People's Republic of Donetsk in Ukraine, an experience that he has sort of written about extensively in his most recent prose. And for a while, he was regularly appearing on the evening news with his gun. As a result of this, in 2017, Prilepin's foreign rights agent, Wiedling, stated that they would no longer represent him, but that they would honour existing contracts and donate all proceeds to Amnesty International. Prilepin, in an interview with state-funded Russia Beyond, acknowledges this fact, acknowledges that since the news that he had been fighting came out, no one was inviting him to international book fairs and no one wanted to translate any more of his novels. He calls out Europe as a false democracy, unwilling to read views contrary to its own. This has not prevented further translations of Prilepin's work. Glagoslav, as you mentioned, have published his 2014 novel, The Monastery, this year, translated by Nicholas Cotin, but it is yet unclear how it will fare at a time when Prilepin's political activities appear to be, if anything, becoming more controversial. This year, he has taken part in the working group that rewrote the Russian constitution, and his new political party, Za Pravdu, for Truth, which he has won the right to run in next year's State Duma elections, released its manifesto, which advocates, among other things, for highly conservative family values and defending Russia with weapons, but he does not state against whom. Whether Prilepin will be published in English again remains to be seen, while it is entirely possible that we have not yet had the final English translation of Sorokin. Thank you. That's me.
Thank you. Really sort of fascinating talk there, and the chat is really very involved. So I'll see if I can put the questions. They're all coming in very, very quickly. I'll see if I can order them into something a bit easier to get through. So I'll start with one from Kathy McAteer. Hello there. Do you think Russian writers stand a better chance of achieving literary recognition in the West if they've actually left Russia, or have spent large chunks of their year living outside Russia? And if there's a link there, why do you think it might be?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought of it that way around, but I suppose that one of the major problems in bringing over Russian writers is PR. If Russian writers are living abroad already, they're very much more likely to be speaking English and be able to travel and sort of carry out publicity themselves. So I think that probably does have a major link. Also, it tends to be the more liberal writers who are living outside of Russia. I can't imagine Prilepin or Mikhail Elizarov ever leaving Russia, but certainly Sorokin and Shishkin and Ulitskaya, they all live out of Russia at least part of the year, partially for political reasons, I think. So I think that might be the link if there is one.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's a correction here from Marion Schwartz, who's joined us.
Okay, good.
Who says that Maidenhair was funded by Transcript and not Institut Periodo.
Okay. No, that's interesting actually, because I've been noticing Maidenhair appears on the Institut Periodo website as something they funded. So there seems to be some crossover, which I haven't actually completely looked into myself, but thank you for pointing that out. I'm going to carry on following that up.
Stephen Wilson wonders where you would put Pilevian in the kind of dichotomy of dissident and conservative.
My very honest answer is that I don't know enough about Pilevin's politics. I know that he and Sorokin are enemies, but I'm not sure if that's based on his political opinions or the fact that they just straight up don't like each other. So I'm afraid I have to be rubbish and not give an answer. I couldn't comment because I just don't know enough about Pilevin, I'm afraid. Maybe someone else does.
He's an odd one, isn't he? Marina Barrel asks, have you contacted Dmitry Bykov, who's the most influential contemporary literary critic and author in Russia today?
Good call. Yeah, he's on my list. He's on my hit list. So I am, in some ways, the pandemic, I know it's not great, but in some ways it's good for me because it means I can conduct my interviews via Zoom and lots of people are in. So yes, he's definitely on my list. Thank you for pointing him out. And I hope to be speaking to, if he agrees to speak to me in the next few months, that would be amazing. But thank you.
And in the chat, Anna Maslyanova wonders whether Bykov's novels have been translated into English, and is answered that Kathy Porter has translated Giade as Living Souls, and that there's a Rus Trans project based in Exeter that's also translated or funded for a translation of June and is now pitching into publishers. So Bykov's work is getting translated.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Marion Schwartz again says that in terms of Sorokin's work getting the major media reviews that it did, Jamie Gambrell might have had a hand in that as a kind of publicist and translator.
Yeah, yes, I suppose that's true. I don't know how it came about. I don't know. Obviously, Farrar, and Giroux and New York Review of Books are quite influential publishers, so I imagine they had something to do with it as well. Yeah, I don't know. It's obviously Jamie's no longer with us. It would be lovely to ask her exactly what her involvement has been. If I'm lucky, maybe I can speak to Ellen Barry and ask her if I can track her down and add her to my very long list.
More questions about Sorokin. Oh, and Marion also mentions that Sorokin started as a visual artist, so that may explain partially his appealing physical presentation.
Yes, it's very much a curated image.
And Ben Phillips wonders, what does Sorokin himself think about his reception in the West as a dissident or oppositionist writer, given his criticisms of literature centricity and the belief in literature as something separate from politics? Or actually, is that not an accurate representation of his views, do you think?
I have a feeling that his views might change. Certainly when he wrote David Plichnik, he was very clear that he wrote it as a political act. I think if my memory serves me rightly, when did he write it? So 2006. Something had angered him. I forget exactly what it is, but he came home, he said, and the story goes, and I think this story he tells in an article, possibly in the New York Times, that he's got these beautiful, he says, Irish or Italian greyhounds, I think, and he came home and he had a big chunk of meat, and he threw this chunk of meat to his beautiful, graceful dog, and his dog sort of went outside in the snow and tore it up and covered everything in blood. And he had a flash of inspiration. He thought of the Oplichniks, and he wrote Day of the Oplichnik within less than a month, I think, as a sort of an angry, deliberately politicized piece of work. And certainly if you were to go through that novel with a fine-tooth comb and pick up every political reference, I mean, they're all there. The one that always comes to mind straight away is his reference to Dugin, Alexander Dugin, who's obviously the main proponent of Eurasianism, and he appears in the book at some point as a hirsute character called Duga, who just keeps chanting Urgazia, Urgazia. It's really, so there's no way that book isn't deliberately political. My other feeling is that he perhaps plays on the fact that he looks like a dissident writer, and that he has been interpreted as such, and that this helps his image in the West. I'm not necessarily saying that it does in Russia, but that's my feeling. I might be wrong, but that's my general impression.
Okay, in the US, a question from Stephen Wilson here. In the US, many bands use GoFundMe or similar crowdfunding websites to generate pre-sales prior to recording. Have any publishers, authors, or translators done similar for translation? He mentions that he'd be willing to pre-buy Pilyadin's Batman Apollo in English.
Well, that's good news. You know, it's not something I've looked into, but that's a really interesting idea. I don't know. I know with some translations now, I'm thinking of the Other Russia's Victoria Lamasco. I know that it was all put together, it was translated and all laid out by N+1, and I'm not sure that they had any funding, but I know that they work on a slightly different basis. So it's possible that that could have been the case in some sense. If there is, I think crowdfunding for translations is an amazing idea. So absolutely, if you want to get that started, that's definitely something that I'd be into, but it's not something that I've come across so far. It's possible that I'm just looking too much at publishers and doing it that way. I haven't come across any smaller concerns, I would say.
I've got to mention actually with Victoria Lamasco that we hosted her first UK show, and she's a big friend of Pushkin House, so her book is for sale on our bookshop, along with actually quite a few of the others that have been mentioned. So at the end I'll put a link in the chat to our bookshop.
Fab. That's good.
Interesting question here from Ruben Woolley. Beyond just liberal and nationalist, is there a kind of anti-government story that Western publishers prefer, and kinds of anti-government or liberal works that don't make the cut?
Yeah, I mean, there must be. There are so few books published translated into English. There must be a fair amount of ostensibly liberal work that just isn't translated. I mean, that's entirely possible. I think publishers would probably have trouble publishing or selling rather anything that was overtly pro-Putin. I just don't think it would be something that people would buy. And obviously, the bigger publishers, as we've seen, have to take everything into account, or the sort of the market trends into account. Translation across frontiers, I can't remember what I called it now, that study that I mentioned earlier, one of the things that they found in speaking to commissioning editors was that they like to commission the same kinds of books as have already sold, so that they know they're going to sell the next batch, so that publishers work in a deliberately conservative manner. So I can't imagine that. So I can only imagine that this narrative, this anti-Putin narrative, is one that everyone's going to stick with. And certainly that list of non-fiction that I read out that Penguin Random House publish, that I simply found by going to their books about Russia. And that was all of their books about Russia. There was nothing neutral at all in that list. So I think that maybe tells a story. But yeah, I'm certain that there are plenty of books by liberal writers or by simply non-political writers that don't make it over at all. And that's an interesting question of, if you think about Mark Krotov's quote about the book needing to be about something for readers to want to buy it, for it to have to be about the sort of corruption of the Russian regime or whatever. Would people read Russian novels that didn't in some way feel very Russian? And in that sense, probably I mean dissident.
Mm-hmm. Can you say something about Ulitskaya's development of vision on Russia in her literature?
Gosh, okay, that's a good question. Sorry, her development of...
I suppose her vision of Russia
Mm-hmm.
in her literature.
Mm-hmm. So the two books of hers that I'm most familiar with are The Big Green Tent and her Jacob's Ladder, which was just published last year, which I actually prefer. I'd say for her vision of Russia, I'd say at the moment it's quite pessimistic if you listen to her interviews and think about her general views. Her novel Big Green Tent is certainly absolutely captivating. It feels like this beautiful sort of nostalgic journey into her childhood, into this sort of Russian circle of Russian intelligentsia that she at one time sort of inhabited, albeit sort of on the periphery. But from my understanding, that isn't necessarily how she sees the novel. And I think she thinks it's very much an anti-Soviet novel against the regime. I think you can read it in both ways, actually. And again, that seems to certainly develop further in Jacob's Ladder, which I actually prefer because it's more about women. I don't know if the person asking the question has read both of these novels. The Big Green Tent, the women in Big Green Tent tend to suffer a lot at the hands of men and seem to make lots of sacrifices, where Jacob's Ladder begins with the scene of a woman breastfeeding and ends with a woman, a pregnant woman, and it feels very much more positive. Yeah, I'm not sure if I can track her changing views of Russia in all that. I'm pretty sure that since the annexation of Crimea, she's been very, very clear about where she stands. She's been attacked for her views in public. At one point, there was a banner with her and I think Boris Akunin and somebody else, I can't remember rightly, sort of hung across the Arbat, and they were sort of as traitors to Russia. I don't think that was quite the wording, but that was the idea. So certainly she's been, when a decision had to be made in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, she's certainly been on that side of the line ever since.
There's a very interesting question here, and I might ask a sort of corollary question to it as well. So who are some of the most highly acclaimed Russian writers that haven't been translated into English? And so my added question is this idea of a canon of Russian writers. Is there a possibility that develops, I suppose it kind of develops retroactively, and that we say today who the canon of writers are, for example, of English literature or Russian classics. But does the publishing trends of contemporary works influence that quite significantly?
Yeah, I think it does. I think what you consider as the canon is a sort of permanently evolving state of affairs. I mean, even looking at that top 50 list, you can see obviously there's the permanent sort of underpinned canon of the classics, but you can see it changes and morphs. Pelevin is no longer popular, and now it becomes Akunin, now it becomes Glukhovsky. It just depends on what's in fashion at the time. The question about who are the most important Russian writers who aren't translated, in all honesty, I find it a little bit more difficult to answer because I am so focused on everything that gets brought over into English. I think the very best way to get a sense of that is to look at Lisa Hayden's blog, Lisa's Bookshelf, because she analyses, I don't know how she has time to read it all, but she analyses everything that gets brought over into English, but also everything, lots of novels written in Russian. So, for example, this year, obviously every year you've got the major prizes. This year, for example, Mikhail Elizarov won the Nat's Best Prize. So he's one of my nationalist authors who wrote The Librarian. He's just won prizes for his new novel Zemlya, The Earth. I'm not always in touch with exactly who's won the prizes. I'm a little bit behind in that respect.
I think that's totally fair. I I think personally for myself, I usually read old books as well. I very rarely pick up contemporary fiction.
Okay.
I don't know how common this is, but I do find it a safer bet to read something that's probably 50 or 60 years old at the most recent than to read modern stuff. And that goes across not just Russia as well.
Mhm.
And I guess there's an idea that there's so much in the past that we haven't read, that catching up and taking a bit of a gamble on something new that hasn't had the chance to be judged in the court of public opinion over 50 years is a bit more kind of it is a bit more of a gamble, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I think you're right. I think any new novel you pick up, if a novel's still around after 50 years, it's probably quite good, or at least there is a reason to read it. Whereas, yeah, I do occasionally come across novels that I don't enjoy and that in contemporary literature, full stop, and certainly in the course of my reading at the moment, yeah, of course there are things that I don't think will stand the test of time. But I feel like at the same point, it's important to read these novels. I mean, for example, and to kind of pay attention to the trends of what's coming out in Russia just now. So, for example, there's a lot of neo-medievalist sort of literature in contemporary Russian fiction just now. The Librarian, in some ways, being that, as it contains lots of sort of neo-medieval battles, which are very, very bloodthirsty, or Laurus, which is set in medieval Russia, or there's also, or the Slinks, for example, actually, there's just the three of them that I mentioned. And that ties in very closely with the politics that's going on in Russia just now, the sort of neo-medievalist almost push, is change in the importance of history for Russia. And I think that's reflected in the literature. So if you don't know about that, maybe that's harder to pick up on, and there's less reason to pick up a new novel. But I think certainly the novels that are being translated and brought out over here, they're all fascinating, and they all do tell you something different. Sankhya, for example, by Plilepin, you might not like what he tells you, but he does tell you something about a section of Russian society. So yes, I think there is plenty of reason to be reading contemporary literature, but I can understand people's reluctance in picking things up, or even knowing where to start, actually.
There are quite a few more questions coming in. One comment here says that Daedalus tried crowdfunding last year to bring out a translation from Italian,
Okay.
but we're not sure if they're persisting with the model. Here's a question. What will happen to the Russian literature translation and publishing model if and when Putin leaves politics? Will we enter a kind of literary black hole?
Yeah, that is an interesting question, which I hadn't thought of, as everyone seems to be convinced he's here forever. Certainly there was a huge slump in Russian translations when the Soviet Union collapsed. And you can see that even in the figures I had in 2001, there was something like 315 different ISBNs sold, and now it's over 800. And I think, again, that goes back to Mark Khrushchev's opinion that we need a reason to read Russian literature, and we're used to that reason being a sort of mostly political one. So yeah, there is a risk that if Russia becomes less politically interesting, that we will read less. And it also obviously then relies on how novels get funded. So I think at the moment, Institute Perivoda, they work with the government, and I think they do a lot of work in supporting Russian literature. And again, that you can see the difference that made in 2011. I think if the way they operated changed, if the environment within which they were operating changed, then that might indeed see a fall. I think, yeah, I think that's my best answer. I think anecdotally, during the Soviet Union, there was an awful lot of translations as well, because there was this huge interest in Russian literature, which did indeed dip in the 90s. But also that could be because the publishing industry was restructuring itself and working out what to do once all the authors had control of their own rights again. So there's always a little bit of an adjustment period.
Mm-hmm. Talking of adjustment periods, one of the questions mentions sort of computer translations. Do you think that in the future, I mean, it might be a while off, but will human translators be replaced by just Google Translate at some point?
God, I hope not. I hope not, for the first reason that talking about translation is fascinating, and it gives you a sort of window into other people's worldview. I think you're never going to get with human translators the same sentence twice, let alone the same paragraph. Or I think no, I don't think, and I don't think it's something that we should that we should hope for, because the art of translation, well, it is an art. Somebody described it to me as the sort of the art of being artless. One of the translators that I spoke to. It's something that exists that, if you've done it well, should be almost invisible. Obviously, we don't advocate for the invisibility of translators. So I think, for a start, Google Translate, especially with Russian, is a very long way off from that, but I should hope that it never comes to pass.
Yeah, I agree. There's a comment here that says that it's from Marina Burrell. I think it's an overstatement to say that Ulitskaya is overtly anti-regime, as her focus is on the role of science and scientists in reconstructing society, and she strongly believes in the leading role of popular science literature in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a fair point. It's more that I think she's definitely against the current regime, and this is evident actually in her actions more than her literature. So the writers that I've been talking about, their literature isn't always overtly political, but I'm writing about them because their actions are. So she has been very, very vocal in her opposition. So yeah, that very well may be the case, that it isn't overt in her literature, her opinion of the state and of the current sort of state of politics. But certainly it is something that she sort of talks about and writes about regularly. So that's why she's in that liberal category. But like I said, this is a really, although I'm developing these categories as I go, and I'm not going to bore you all with the endless iterations of what it means to be liberal and how these categorizations work, because they don't mean the same thing for us in the UK as they do in Russia. Sorokin, for example, we would call him a liberal writer, but I don't think that is 100% the case. And I think if he was to describe his politics to us, we might not see him as such. So those are very much working categories that I'm trying to better explain as I go along, but it's quite a tricky subject, I have to say.
Question here from Ekaterina Rogachevska. Are there any new translations or editions of Soviet authors? Brian Koretnik is almost single-handedly translating Russian emigre writers of the first wave, but are there any other significant gaps between Tolstoy and now?
Oh, I'm sure that there are. But I wish I could answer that question properly, but I'm afraid I'm just so focused on getting through all of the contemporary writers that I'm not entirely sure what's missing in that gap in between. I know that there's a lot of work going on everywhere, which is really, really heartening to see. But yeah, I'm really sorry I can't answer that question.
Mm-hmm. Do you know if Alexei Ivanov has been translated yet? As he's a major recent author, especially on history.
I don't think that name rings a bell. I haven't, my database is somewhere else on my computer, obviously, but I can certainly, if you want to send me a message, I can certainly check. It doesn't ring a bell, so I don't remember having seen it. That doesn't mean that it hasn't happened. My memory isn't as amazing as it should be. So yeah, if you want to drop me a message afterwards, I can look it up for sure.
I don't know if this is worth asking. It's completely not really relevant to your work on this subject, but I'd quite like to know if you know at all which British writers, contemporary or classic, are most popular in Russia. Because when I was in Russia, I noticed that some very odd things were popular there that I and no other English person had ever read. I mean, maybe some, in the Victorian times had read Clarissa or Robinson Crusoe, but nobody I know of my age or even my parents' age has actually read either of them. And yet they're very popular in Russia. Do you know if there's a kind of similar state with the kind of contemporary writers?
Yeah, I don't know if they're unusual things to be popular, but certainly the things that keep popping up, I subscribe to. A good place to get Russian novels online is Litres, and you can sort of download novels that way. And so they send me little emails advertising what they've got new. And today I got an email telling me that the new Sally Rooney was translated. There's a lot of Stephen King, a lot of genre fiction, to be honest. That's what it tends to be. I couldn't reel all of the names off the top of my head for you, but certainly, yeah, that's what I would say, that a lot of just the kind of most obvious genre fiction is being translated, or crime thrillers and things like this. But certainly, yeah, Robinson Crusoe is something I keep coming across. It's something that's referred to in, I can't remember which novel it is now that we've looked at. But yeah, it's something that in this one of the most recent novels I was looking at, someone puts it in the chat if they remember, that Robinson Crusoe seems to be the source of childhood memories for one of the sort of contemporary writers. So obviously they've grown up with it. Also, Agatha Christie is always, I'm sure you know, like always so popular. I know she's not contemporary, so popular in Russia, which obviously isn't necessarily the case here, not to that extent anyway. So yeah, there is some kind of weird imbalance to what you would expect to be popular and what actually is sometimes.
People in the chat are saying that Julian Barnes and Jojo Moyes are popular.
Oh yeah, and it's in The Aviator. Thank you, Naomi. That's right. I knew it was in one of them we've read. Yeah. So it's in The Aviator that the main character remembers his childhood, and he remembers being read that novel when he was ill, and it's a really important sort of motif in the novel that keeps returning and returning. So, yeah. Thank you.
There's a comment here which says that Silver Age novelists and other early 20th century writers are probably underrepresented in translation.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds about right to me, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it was in Anna's talk that we were talking about, I think, Korolenko, and how he's absent from the UK conception of the Russian canon, whereas Gorky, for example, isn't.
Yeah, absolutely. I know it's interesting. It would be interesting to know what makes some writers stick and sort of stay with the British consciousness. But I guess that's the same question as we're asking now, why some, that I've just been discussing, why some contemporary writers make it and stay, and some are just sort of on the periphery.
I have quite a few, I have very few current questions at the moment, so I'll just give people another couple of minutes to get last few questions in. While I'll make a comment that I just sort of scribbled down, which is that Prilepin, I think it was, you said that the Europe was a sort of false democracy where people are unwilling to read opposing views, and I wrote down that at least we can run candidates in elections with opposing views. But,
that's good. Touche.
Actually, I think probably in Russia there is today an idea that the West is, completely woke and will cancel anybody who doesn't agree. And I suppose, in fact, that debate is raging all over the West at the moment. But I like to think that in the ways that really matter, we're still ahead.
Yeah. It's an interesting question, isn't it? And I think actually just by looking at Prilepin, he's quite a controversial character. So I've had some quite strong reactions to the fact that I'm not publicizing his work. He exists and he's discussed and wins prizes. And I think this is a completely different debate entirely, but I think you can't just ignore people because you don't agree with them. I think that's my main point.
Yeah, of course. Especially when you're writing about it academically. I mean, it exists, it has to be talked about.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, let's take this as the final question. Is Russian poetry translated in any similar way to the contemporary or classical, actually? No, contemporary and classical canon. As in, is there a kind of ideological categorization among the Western publishers of Russian poetry?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I haven't been looking into poetry too much, but I can tell you a little bit of what I know. certainly there is a movement to publish quite a lot of liberal, politically active poets. So, oh my goodness, what's his name? Give me 2 seconds. Bella Shevich translates. She's written about it at the back of her novel, her wee translation. So I'm just going to give you his name now, because like I said, I have a terrible memory. So she translates Vsevolod Nekrasov. That's her. So he's quite a, and this copy is lovely, and she concludes his poem at the end of her afterword there. So she works on poets like him. Also, independent presses are involved in publishing quite a lot of Russian poetry. And just here, sorry, I'm just next to my bookshelf. I don't know if you've seen this little book that has been published. It's a really little book that's been published by Isolari on a subscription, and this is all new feminist Russian poetry.
Well, actually, yeah, that's I think one of the main people behind that is Galina Rimbu, who was our resident with our poetry residency last year, or this year, I suppose. Feels like 2 years ago, but it was just in March. So we're very pleased to have hosted her, actually. So there is definitely a lot of, I wouldn't call it liberal, it's more like left wing.
Well, that's kind of, yeah, that's where these what's the word, classifications come in.
And actually, a couple of people in the chat are saying that Prigov, actually, yes, we've got an event on him on the 22nd. So if you're interested in sort of contemporary Russian poetry, come down to that virtually. It should be on our Eventbrite, I think, where we'll be doing some readings and playing some recordings of Prigov's work. And Kirill Medvedev and Maria Stepanova also both have relatively recent translations.
Yes. Oh, I forgot. Yes, absolutely.
I'm going to put I'm just going to do a kind of little plug and put the Pushkin House Bookshop webpage in the chat, because somebody's mentioned Christmas lists. So if you are shopping, check us out. But thank you, Sarah, for this talk. It's been absolutely fascinating. I mean, very strong on the kind of the hard facts, and that's really great to hear. You know, exactly what the state of the translation world is, as well as the trends within it. So thank you very much. And Miriam Maguire is thanking me in the chat, and I'm going to thank her back, and all of our previous speakers for this this series with the Anglo-Russian Research Network. The Anglo-Russian Research Network, as I said at the beginning, I'll just repeat it again, they're an academic group based in Exeter, but now existing throughout the UK and probably further afield as well. And they are currently looking for submissions for seminars and reading groups. So if you have any ideas, go online and check them out. The link to their website and to the people who take submissions are on the event pages for these. But thank you, Miriam, and thank you, Anna Naslonova, for arranging these, and Sarah for speaking today, and to all of our public who's supported us by buying tickets and coming out and being absolutely brilliant in the comments. Thank you, and hopefully see you at our future events.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Well, until next time, goodbye.